All right, welcome everyone to another fascinating episode of Faith Unaltered. I am your host, Tyler Fowler. With me is my special guest today, Dr. Kevin Timpe, and we are going to talk about autism and exactly what that means for the church. What is autism, and how can church members better equip ourselves to not only understand autism, but to help others with autism in the church. This is new to me. So let me just, for those who don't know, let me just give a brief background real quick about even my interest in this subject. So very recently, my daughter, so my 4-year-old daughter, Kelsey, was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And this kind of hit us out of nowhere. So my wife had been thinking about, seeing, so we've got 2 little girls. So comparing, and I know this is not a good thing to say per se, but with our little girls, we noticed that there was a difference between both of them. My youngest was doing things a lot earlier than my oldest, and there were things that my oldest was doing that, I don't know, just seemed different. We didn't really think of it, kind of looking back now, hindsight's 2020, but we didn't really, I don't know, put a label on it per se. We just thought she was a, funny little girl or whatever. But as she got older, things started, definitely, and I'll go into this a little bit more. I'm just giving a 30,000 foot view, but going into this a little bit more, there were things that she was doing that made us concerned. And so we started talking with different people. We started researching this. I actually, Kevin, I reached out to you after we had got the diagnosis from our medical doctor to research this even more. And so I thought, you know what? Why not, since I'm already talking to you about this anyway, bring you on and let's have a discussion about autism. Before we dive into it, this is your first time on the show, Kevin, so thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. Could you just give a little bit of, just introduce yourself real quick for our audience who may not know who you are? And let me unmute you. And there we go.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks for having me, Tyler.
Yeah.
I'm a philosopher. I currently work at Calvin University. I'm in my 9th year here. Prior to that, I worked at 2 other universities also teaching philosophy. So I've been a professional philosopher for about 20 years. Most of my early work focused on metaphysics of freedom and issues in philosophy of religion, then got into virtue ethics. But over the past, let me see, about 10 to 11 years, for reasons that I think we'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute, just started thinking more about disability, in part because our oldest child is multiply disabled, including an autism diagnosis that we got when he was about 6 years old. Okay. And so there's a way in which my life has come to be shaped more and more by these issues. And so I do my best to balance being a professional academic, a parent to 3 children, a spouse, and also a disability advocate in various sorts of contexts. Yeah. And juggling life gets really, really complicated. So I feel like I'm always trying to do too much and not doing enough. And trying to just drop the, like the tennis balls and not the chainsaws.
Right. And fair enough. My wife, she wants another, we're trying for a boy, or she wants to try for a boy. I'm fine with 2, but being a parent of 3, is the third one, would you say go for it or what do you think?
Give other people advice on the number of children to have. Our third is a real joy. Okay. She and I run together. I've got her listening to metal. There's all kinds of stuff that she likes to do with me, watch horror movies that the other kids don't like to do with me. But the right number of kids is up to individual couples. So there is a sense in which the first is the hardest. The second is the second hardest. I'm told after a certain number, you don't notice anymore. That I don't understand that.
Okay.
But there is especially when they're young, a certain challenge when they are when the number of children outnumber the parents. And now that two of ours are teenagers, like they still outnumber us, but it's not the same kind of herding process out in public that sometimes happens when you've got three young ones.
Right on. That, and that's what I was thinking. Is like we've got two, we're two, so we got a good even number here. So we'll see how it goes. Maybe in the future, God will bless us with a little boy or another little girl. We'll see. But Kevin, I was introduced to you through your work on libertarian free will, and for those who don't know you and are interested in that subject, I recommend definitely your book on sourcehood libertarianism. Fantastic work. So thank you for that. And that's all within a Christian context, and then later found out about your involvement and work within the topic of philosophy of disability. And now I know you just mentioned your eldest child now and in other interviews, and that the lived experience of being a parent of a child with a rare genetic disorder was what got you really digging in to the philosophy of disability. But did you ever feel like this was like your next step, so to say, in your study of libertarian free will and personhood? Or in your mind, is philosophy of disability like totally disconnected from the topic of libertarian free will?
Yeah. So for me, the first time I started thinking about disability in a philosophical and an academic context, our son was in first grade. So this was about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And we had known that he had a genetic condition from about 6 months old.
Okay.
When he was diagnosed, there were no discussions of his particular genetic condition in the medical literature. So the geneticist was like, here is what his genetic code is like.
Yeah.
Go figure it out. And now there's about 100 diagnosed cases in the world. But early on, it was just
Wow.
our first experience of parenting was just trying to figure out all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And when he was in first grade, we realized that his public school back in Idaho had been violating state and federal law with respect to his education for about a year and a half. And so this was where I started, okay, we've got to make things better for him. And at that same semester, when I was applying for my first ever sabbatical. And so I had to come up with a big enough project to justify a semester not teaching.
Okay.
And just a few years before, I had done the Free Will and Philosophical Theology book, where I take the view of freedom that I develop in the Sourcehood book and try to use it to make sense of a number of Christian doctrines and to see if we can tell a coherent theological story on the assumption of this particular kind of libertarianism. And I was just like, I don't know what else to say about free will. I mean, there's always little bitty details that can be said, but I thought I kind of said everything that I know what to say here, at least in terms of a big project.
Right.
So I thought, well, if I'm doing this work as a parent trying to figure out disability, and it was clear from early on that the kinds of skills that I had as an academic, as a professional philosopher, were really helpful in doing the kind of advocacy work. I could read the legal code, I could go make arguments. It was like not a whole lot else, sometimes that you think that you can do with philosophical training, but it proved really, really useful. So if I'm already using my philosophical skills and thinking in this way, why don't I just turn to try to make sense of how I should understand this experience that my family is going through and other people that I care about are going through. Yeah. And so I decided to start working on a book on disability and agency. So in one sense, it was very continuous with the work I had been doing before on philosophy of agency and free will. 10 years later, I'm still trying to finish up this book. My goal is to have a draft off to a publisher in the next month. Okay. But I've failed to meet that goal a couple times already. So in one sense, initially it was just sort of a continuous outgrowth of a lot of what I was already thinking about human agency. Yeah. But in a different way, it has really shifted a lot of my philosophical work. As I said before, most of what I did for the first decade of my professional life was just metaphysics of human freedom, issues in philosophy of religion. Thinking about free will got me thinking about character formation, which got me into virtue ethics. Right. But in the last 10 years, I've written stuff on public policy, philosophy of education, social philosophy, social epistemology, right? And there's a sense in which disability has opened up the conceptual space that I do my philosophical work in.
Mhm.
And so even while my initial foray into philosophy of disability was very continuous with some of my earlier work, there's a sense in which it has kind of exploded the set of things that I'm working on. My most recent paper that got accepted is a paper looking at the religious exemption to the ADA and basically arguing in political philosophy and philosophy of law that the way that the religious exemption to the ADA on the basis of religious freedom has come to function in our culture is problematic. And that's a topic I never would have thought in graduate school that I'd be publishing on.
Right, right. No, and that's good. Briefly, could you explain what you mean? And this is just kind of a follow up to what you said. But what you mean by the religious exemption of the ADA?
Yeah, so when the lobbying for the ADA was building steam in the late 80s, Bush picked the ADA to be the characteristic legislation of his compassionate conservatism.
Okay.
And so there was a real push to finally get it passed, even though the bill had been in development for, in some ways, over a decade. But one of the sticking points was religious institutions wanted to be exempt in the same way that lots of businesses wanted to be exempt. And so the ADA does not actually apply. It applies to public accommodations, public schools, restaurants, theaters, and built into the law is an exemption for religious institutions. So churches, synagogues, mosques, Christian schools do not have to comply with at least Title III of the ADA, which is about physical access to things. There's parts of Title I which deals with employment that they sometimes do have to follow there.
Okay.
But if your local coffee shop does not have accessible parking and you ask them nicely and they still don't do it, the proper response is to file a complaint with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice.
Right.
If your local church doesn't have an accessible parking spot, there's nothing that you can do about it because of the religious exemption.
Wow. Okay. And that should be something, I mean, thinking about the church, that should be something like automatically that's kind of happening instead of fighting against it, like providing access to as many people as possible. But it sounds like some churches are actually not doing that, or actually on the other side of that concept. Is that fair?
And
Wow.
certainly the case. I mean, again, it depends by local churches. The local church that I attend, the building was constructed to not have any stairs in it on purpose as a way of accessibility. And so even the raised platform in our sanctuary has a ramp built in, shaped like a conch shell on purpose. Okay. There's a ramp going up. But one of the leading lobbyists for the religious organization made in letters that he sent to Congress saying why religious entities should be exempt. One of them was one of the reasons, right, was the cost that it would take for churches. Cost was also argued for why businesses should be exempt. It wasn't allowed to carry the day in that consideration. But one of his other claims is that churches do a great job about accessibility. And so churches don't need to have the legal requirements to do this because there's not a problem. And this to me is just mind-boggling that this seemed to have any sort of traction. When you look at what some of the data suggests is that our culture is not great for disabled folks in all sorts of ways.
Sure.
But the data suggests that some of the least welcoming, least accommodated spaces are religious spaces. So autistic adults, for example, are less than half as likely to be active participants of a local congregation than are non-autistic adults. Which suggests something about maybe the way that autistic folks tend to be treated in their local congregations and feeling undervalued, unwelcome. And so this idea that churches shouldn't be subject to the ADA because they don't have a problem, to me is just, as I said, mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's bogus, actually. That's wild. Okay, so getting back then to the questions I sent you, I appreciate you going in depth with that, because before listening, I heard you mention something about this on another interview, but I never thought of this in my life. And so thank you for bringing that up then and now. But so then listening to another lecture, and you haven't used this term, but I'm assuming it's going to come up during this discussion at some point. And so I want to go ahead and define things. There was one term that you kept using, and that I've heard in the book that you recommended, Sincerely Your Autistic Child, which is a fascinating book. I highly recommend that as well to anyone interested in this subject. But the term ableism seems to come up in talks about autism. And so can you just briefly describe what you meant and what other people mean when they use the term ableism?
Yeah. So the idea of ableism and a lot of the disability rights movement was intentionally structured on earlier civil rights movements.
Okay.
And so the term ableism, and it's actually often used as disableism in the UK. So there's just sort of a slight linguistic difference between us and across the Atlantic.
Sure.
In the same way that racism is often understood either as individual feelings of discrimination and ill will towards people of a certain race, or is sometimes meant in structural ways, right? The ways that social structures can be put in place to devalue folks of certain races, the same way that sexism can do that. And I personally think that there's great work that favors understanding both sexism and racism in these kinds of structural and not just individual ill will, individual bad attitude senses, even though there is a lot of sexism and racism in those ways.
Sure.
The idea of ableism is that in the same way that we have social structures that are set up in a way to devalue the experiences of disabled folks, to decenter them as part of our lives, that there are ways in which that happens in a parallel way to how race happens. The best working definition of ableism that I'm aware of, and I borrow this from T.L. Lewis, who is a disability scholar and lawyer. I believe they currently work at Georgetown, and they've got a great blog post where they kind of update this every year.
Okay.
T.L. Lewis's definition of ableism is a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply connected with eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. The systematic oppression leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth, living place, health or wellness, their ability to satisfactorily reproduce or produce, excel, behave. So, so the basic idea, and to illustrate this, I want to connect back with what I said about the religious exemption, because I think that this illustrates this.
Yeah.
Right. The number one time in U.S. history when private Christian schools increased in number was immediately before and after the Brown versus Board of Education decision that would desegregate public schools, right? And so folks saw that this was coming, or it had just happened. And in a way to sort of protect the racism built into certain parts of our culture, if you couldn't have racially segregated public schools, what we'll just do is we'll go make private schools. And since they're private, we can let folks in as we want.
Wow.
And so you had the flight of white families largely in the South from public schools into private schools right before and after the Brown versus Board of Education decision that would desegregate.
Okay.
In the same way, public schools have to take disabled students, and there are certain things in place that they have to do in order to meet disabled students' needs, according to what's now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA.
Okay.
But private religious schools don't have to accept disabled students, or if the disabled students' disabilities get to be sufficiently difficult for them to know what to do with, they can just rescind their students' admission. This happened to our son a little over a year ago. The Christian school he'd been going to for, I think, 9 years just said, we no longer have the resources to give your son the supports that he needs.
Wow.
So we are going to forcibly disenroll him at the end of the school year. Now, The school has $81 million in unrestricted or assets beyond liabilities. They've got the resources, they just weren't. So what this illustrates is there's a way in which the school just devalues certain kinds of disabled lives.
Mm-hmm.
And because school policies are not just about how individual teachers or administrators feel, you've got social structures
Mm-hmm.
that can then devalue people either explicitly or implicitly or right sort of unintentionally but systematically. Prior to the passage of the ADA, if you wanted to go into the Capitol building in the United States, you had to climb large flights of stairs. So
Right.
disabled folks were just structurally prevented from admission, and that's a kind of ableist architecture.
Wow. And that makes sense because going to Washington, D.C., we went to visit the Lincoln Memorial, and there's only one way to get up there.
Yep.
So, oh, wow. Okay. I'm not going to lie, Kevin, and forgive me for the language, but that would piss me off. Like, if I was sending my daughter to public school, which, thinking about it, and my wife and I are currently having this discussion, we're genuinely considering homeschooling. Just for other reasons, but regardless, to say that we no longer have the funding, or we no longer, in essence, care to try to help your child and other children that may be attending that school with a disability, we're done. That would piss me off. And it sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it sounds like the way our system is set up is for the, well, to put children with disabilities at a disadvantage instead of an advantage. Is that fair to say at this point anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Now there are certain laws that are right aiming to give disabled folks
Yeah.
civil rights.
Mhm.
I happen like the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and IDEA. I don't think that either of them is nearly sufficient. I think
Okay.
that I know a lot of folks who have disabled children that because even pushing hard enough and right pushing to get their children what they need in public schools is hard enough, even with legal protections, they end up homeschooling.
Yeah.
Right. And so for them, it's just, I'm tired of the fight. It's not worth it. We're just, and again, if people want to make the decision to homeschool,
Yeah.
that's fine. Right. But it shouldn't be
Yeah.
done because the system is set up
Right.
to make it so hard.
Right.
As problematic as public schools are, private schools are in a sense even worse in this regard because you don't have any legal protections that you can use
Right.
if you raise sufficient difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a way in which disabled folks have gotten tired over the years of asking nicely, because asking nicely to the disadvantaged often doesn't get them the kind of traction in public debate that you might think it would.
Sure.
Right, which is why they had to go to disability rights activism. If you ask those hard questions in a public school, you've at least got something to back them up. But in a private school, if you ask the questions hard enough, they can just say, we're done with you.
Wow.
And so it is, in this regard, significantly worse for many, many families of disabled children in private schools than public schools. Now, the school that expelled our son still takes some disabled students. Now, they limit the number of disabled students that they admit every year so that they don't have to commit too many of the school's resources in order to providing the supports that they need. So there's already sort of a limitation of how many folks can get in.
Yeah.
But what our son's disabilities needs and what other kids with disabilities need aren't always the same thing. And the school
Right.
is willing to do what they were used to doing, but what they were used to doing wasn't what our son needed. And so if you think about
Wow.
right, T.L. Lewis's definition,
Yep.
a way of assigning value based on socially constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, excellence, fitness, intelligence, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be what's happening in lots of these cases. Even if a church isn't physically accessible in its location, it's because even if nobody had the thought, we want to exclude folks, right? The way that
Sure.
a lack of an accessible environment functions is to devalue the people that need those accommodations or access options.
Right. No, that's this conversation is going to be interesting. I'll just say that. Normally, I'm always happy-go-lucky and everything like that, but hopefully we can turn it around. How about that?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be kind of a downer, right? When I talk about
No, it's not you, right?
that history is a downer, right? Like,
yes.
The last 2 weeks, I teach a class on disability. I'm teaching this, and the first 2-3 weeks of the course is just walking through the history to recognize how problematic a lot of it is.
Yeah.
And the students are like, "Do we get to any like happy stuff?" We'll get there. You made a comment earlier, like, right, that it pisses you off,
Yeah.
and I think that it should in a certain way, right? And for me, one of the tricky parts of advocacy is the more that I do it, the more I live in this just sort of state of pent up background rage against these kinds of systems.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes it's not as foregrounded in my thinking. So I wrote a paper that the last couple of years trying to make sense of how do we live in this kind of state of significant anger at structural systems that if we can't fix easily,
right?
But it looks like anger's the right response, and then we're just like stewing in anger for a long, right? And so this to make sense of what that experience is, right? Like how for us to make sense of it without it, at least for me as a virtue ethicist, who typically thinks that the virtues are supposed to be excellences that benefit our well-being.
Right.
I think that sometimes the virtuous response is anger. Now, there's bad ways that anger can go.
Sure.
But like my anger at structural ableism doesn't seem to contribute to my well-being in the short term.
No.
So yeah, I often go to sleep every night in this state of it shouldn't be this hard. The system shouldn't be this resistant. It shouldn't be required.
Right.
Get some sleep, start up again tomorrow, and keep doing the work.
Right, and keep doing the work, and that's the important part. I believe, as whenever you were talking, a verse came to mind that St. Paul mentions, and that is, be angry and do not sin. Right. And so even though anger is a passion, I like what you said, it's anger, I think, is an appropriate response to this kind of stuff. But to stew on anger, that could obviously lead to bad things down the road. And so we definitely want to find a way to turn that into something productive, obviously. And so that'd be interesting to talk to you about that too. But let's keep going then. So I think this next question I have for you is a really good segue into what we've been talking about already. But so in your opinion then, how can the church, and I guess this would include even the private schools that kind of flow under the banner of Christian, but mainly I'm talking about, our worship services on Sunday, the church building per se. How can the community of believers better support children with autism and other disabilities in participating fully in worship services and other church activities?
Yeah, the first thing I want to say is to take your question and broaden it a little bit here.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
As much as I care about making church services more welcoming for autistic children, I want to also make them welcoming for autistic adults.
Yeah.
Because autistic children grow up and become autistic adults. And there are some ways in which the evidence looks that we're actually less good with certain kinds of disabilities for adults than we are for children in the churches. So again, like sometimes there are things that we need to do for disabled children that we might not also have to do for all disabled adults. But disability, in my view, is really, really complicated, and there's not just one thing that we need to do.
Yeah.
So with that slight broadening of the question, I think that the first thing to do is just increase awareness, right? Like, so I didn't used to be aware that churches didn't have to be accessible. I didn't used to be aware that autistic adults were less than half as likely to go to church or synagogue or mosque than non-disabled adults. I was right. So the first thing, and one of the reasons that I do some writing and a fair bit of talking on just the reality of what the situation is like, is you can't work to fix a problem until enough people are aware of the problem. So the first thing is just raising awareness.
Mm-hmm.
My disability class right now is we're watching the documentary Crip Camp that came out a number of years ago, and I love the film. It is made available legally in its entirety on YouTube. It's also done by Netflix, but even if you don't have a Netflix, you can account, you can watch it. And
Okay.
it's a history basically of the disability rights movement in the United States, connecting it to this camp in upstate New York, Camp Jened, that was for a lot of disabled teens, who then went out and became some of the leading advocates, connects it with the larger cultural movements of the hippie culture and sexual revolution. And
Oh, wow.
so, one thing churches could do is just have a public viewing of Crip Camp and then talk about it. I think that everybody in our culture should watch that film or a film like it.
Okay.
So there's ways just to raise awareness.
Okay.
So that'd be the first thing.
Okay.
And then the second thing is like the best thing that if a church recognizes that maybe we need to do more, resist. The second step would be resist the sort of self-protection movement, right?
Okay.
It is super easy for folks to say, well, but I didn't mean to, we've got good intentions. And I'll be honest, this is a response that I find more in Christian contexts than I find in other contexts.
Okay.
And I think that intentions matter, right? If you intentionally step on my foot and break my toe, that's in one sense worse than you accidentally stepping on my foot and breaking my toe, right? Because it shows that you're got some kind of antagonism to me.
Sure.
In both cases, I got a broken foot.
Right.
And you just merely saying, but I didn't mean to, I had good intentions, isn't going to solve the broken toe issue.
Right.
So we need to resist the temptation to get defensive.
Mm-hmm.
And because sort of the importance of what we're trying to do, our intentions matter for a lot of people's religious lives and Christianity, right? I think that defensive movement is just easier for folks to do. So become aware, don't get defensive.
Okay.
And then the third step is, right, we need to figure out, and this is, I think, really what your question's about, we need to figure out what to actually do.
Yeah.
And often what we don't realize is the best thing to figure out to do is to reach out to the experts. And if you want to know what to do for autistic folks, the experts are going to be the autistic adults that have lived with this condition for 20, 30, 40 years. This is why the book that I recommended to you is, I think, so good. It's a book, Letters to My Autistic Self, if I remember the title.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of autistic adults, it's written to their earlier selves or to their parents.
Right.
And so it is autistic adults looking back on their experiencing, saying what they wish they had known and they wish they could have shared with their parents.
Yes.
That book is a treasure trove of expertise from the folks that know it best. But as I said, a lot of our churches don't have autistic folks in it because we've already made them sufficiently feel unwelcome.
Mm-hmm.
And so what the church might have to do is sort of like intentionally reach out to folks that used to come that don't come anymore, or to local, find your local autism self-advocacy network representative, which is a great national organization run by autistic adults. Okay. To find out what could be done. And again, this isn't just for autism. You can do something similar for all sorts of disabilities. If you want, if there's a child in your congregation that has cerebral palsy and the church is trying to figure out what would be most useful to make that family feel welcome, valued, able to participate, right? Talk to somebody who's an adult with cerebral palsy.
Go to the source.
Yeah. And we often don't do that because sometimes going to the source would, again, require us to go to the very people that we've hurt, and oftentimes don't notice that we've hurt and pushed away unintentionally.
Right. I know that in my, just as a walk as a Christian, there are times whenever I have not intended at all and didn't even know sometimes that I was sinning against someone and hurt their feelings or whatever. And maybe it's not even as broad as a direct sin against them. Maybe I just hurt their feelings unintentionally, but you still have that sense of culpability, right, to make things right, to reconcile. And so I love that. I love what you're saying. And as the church, we should be the ones wanting to do that in this world. This is what Jesus said. If you have a qualm with your brother, leave your gift at the altar and reconcile before then coming and making that sacrifice, because your worship's null if you don't do that. And so absolutely, I think every good thing starts with conversation, right? And just if somebody, and this goes with so many things, like what you said, anything and everything, but you're right, go to the source, get the conversation at least started, right? And God only knows what can happen from that. A whole lot of good things, I got a feeling, if that's our intention from the get-go. And so, okay, so now shifting focus to more personal point of view, I guess we could say, and that is how, and so just to preface this real quick, it's interesting because in doing my research and then coming up with this question, I haven't necessarily asked this question per se to myself, to God, about my daughter particularly. And I don't think, we haven't had this conversation, but I don't think my wife has either, but I've heard this from other parents, and it makes sense to me, given putting this in a Christian context. But just out of curiosity, Kevin, how do we, as Christians, address the question of why when it comes to disabilities like autism within a Christian framework? Why did God allow this to happen is the main question that I'm thinking of at this point.
So I think problem of evil questions are hard because there's not a single response to, it's going to settle all the problems of evil. I think that disability is hard because I actually don't think that disability is a single thing. It's a cluster of a bunch of, so if you take two hard questions and put them together.
Throw them together.
Now, there are certainly some cases where I think that disabilities are the result of, right, people's bad choices, right? Right. Drunk drivers sometimes crash into folks and cause disability. And why is that person disabled? Well, because of, right, whoever was at fault in the accident.
Sure.
There is a certainly understandable reaction, especially as parents, especially as first-time or early parents, right? You want to do the best for your kids. And so when something comes up like an autism diagnosis or cerebral palsy diagnosis or trisomy 20, whatever it is, it is very natural for us to say why, and where that why becomes, what did we do wrong?
Yeah.
And I think that is so easy in part because we have a culture that still widely thinks about disability as a bad thing, right? And the number one response that my guess is that you have received when you tell other people that your daughter was diagnosed as autistic was, I'm sorry. And often what they mean by that is, oh, that's too bad, right? It's a response of pity.
Yeah.
Now there's a sense in which I think the I'm sorry response is the right one.
Okay.
Your whole family is now going to have to do a lot of work to get her what she deserves.
Sure.
That's gonna, right, sometimes require blood, sweat, and tears and come to nothing. So there's a sense in which the I'm sorry can be a statement of solidarity.
Right.
I'm a little bit further down this journey. I know that some of what your family is likely to experience, and it sucks, and it shouldn't be like that, right?
Fair enough.
We're in a culture where, because we typically think that all disabilities are what Elizabeth Barnes calls in her work on disability, which I highly recommend, a bad difference, right? It's easy for us to say, to treat all disability as a bad thing, as an intrinsic bad thing, and to sort of figure out then, right, what have I done in order for, right, this? And it's the same impulse we see in the scriptures, right? Yeah. The disciples bring a disabled person to Jesus.
Yeah.
Or if his friends bring a disabled person to Jesus, who sinned? This guy? This guy's parents.
Or his parents, yeah.
And like Jesus is way more gracious in all sorts of ways than I would be. Right? But he's got to be exasperated. That's the exact wrong question.
Okay.
The question isn't who's at fault, but what should the church's response be.
Be.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've gotten into a conversation with some friends actually just earlier today via text about some of the healing narratives. And the healing narratives, I think, are really complicated to respond to. I don't think that Jesus heals people in all cases because what they have needs to be healed.
Okay.
But because of the way that the disability functioned in ancient Jewish context, right, was often the grounds for social exclusion, right?
Yep.
If you've got leprosy, you're not allowed in town because they're worried about contamination.
Yep.
So sometimes Jesus physically healed folks, not necessarily because they physically needed to be healing, but because that was the way to restore them to a community that should have properly valued them in the first place.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Yeah.
However, you still have then just a couple books later in the New Testament, Paul, when he's looking around for a metaphor for how to think of sin, still uses disability as the metaphor for disobedience, for sin, for lack, etc. So I think that, and again, Paul's writing in a context where that assumption makes sense, but I don't think that we need to necessarily endorse Paul's ableism, even though I think, Paul's writing a lot of the New Testament that we need to take authoritative in various times.
Sure.
So it's very natural for us to think, what did we do wrong? Yep. Right. And this pressure especially is going to hit in our culture, mothers. Right. And because the way in which the parenting pressures, parenting responsibilities, parenting leadership is often gendered in our culture. And because it is, mothers are in almost all cases the ones that experience the pregnancy and carry the baby. It's very easy for women who find that they have disabled child to have questions like, did I drink too much coffee? Did I exercise too much? And this is really, really unfortunate. And we've got to be very gracious to folks that are experiencing these kinds of things. It is a huge learning curve to be a parent, and it's a bigger learning curve to how to be a parent of a disabled child. And so we have to give folks all sorts of grace, all sorts of compassion to help them through, those kinds of experiences.
Right.
So your question that I've now begun to answer way too long and not really even got, is how do we think about the cause of disability? And again, I want to say that not all disability is the same. Somebody who is made a paraplegic from a drunk driving accident is different in certain ways than the family that I recently talked to, whose child was born as a having paraplegia, right? So different disabilities we want to say different things about. Yeah. I don't think that autism is a bad thing. Okay. Now, I think that being autistic can often make all sorts of things way, way, way harder, both for the person who experiences it and for the caregivers, right? Especially in childhood that are taking care of it. So I think the question of why does God cause autism is, in a sense, why does God cause biological diversity in all sorts of ways? And so I think that at least certain kinds of neurodiversity, including autism, have probably been around as long as the human species has been around. There's good archaeological, anthropological evidence that this is probably the case, even though we have come to think of this as way more common because we're getting better at testing. We've got better widespread testing, and also the diagnostic criteria for autism have changed, broadening it, which explain. It's not because people took vaccines, right? Like there is no evidence whatsoever that contaminants and vaccines are responsible for autism. And I think that when Christian folks reinforce this kind of connection, it's incredibly problematic.
Okay.
Human biology is really, really complicated, and brains are really complicated, and some of them function in different sorts of ways. Yeah. And so part of what it means to be human is to have a widespread variation. And some of that variation is going to be certain kinds of neurodiversity, including autism. And again, autism itself is a very widespread spectrum. Yeah. And so the current official diagnosis is autism spectrum disorder. Love the autism bit, love the spectrum bit.
but
The
not so much the disorder.
bit
Yeah.
is complicated,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. No, that's good. It's interesting that you bring up vaccines. So I'm going to clip that and send it to a person. I won't mention any names, but they basically had the idea that because they vaccinated their child, they're the reason, and the vaccines are the reason that their child now has autism. And that's just interesting to me. I'll put it like that. But no, that's interesting that you mentioned that, Kevin. I appreciate it.
In some ways, I
Yeah.
totally get the impulse, right?
Right.
Like when there's
Right.
a sense in which psychologically I find it easier to go through something when I think it's my fault, because I blame myself rather than to say, who the hell knows why I'm going through this?
Yeah.
So again, I get the impulse, especially in a culture where this autism vaccine connection has been promulgated way longer than it should has, and there's all sorts of resistance to the actual scientific evidence here.
Yeah.
So I get the impulse, right? I just think that the impulse that the person that you were saying, talking about, and again, this is pretty widespread, is unfortunate because it then makes the person feel responsible for something that's not their fault. It reinforces this idea that the condition itself is a bad thing, rather than that the struggles that you and your family might go through because of this condition are going to be hard.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. That's good. Okay. So then talking about Christ and in his healing ministry per se, that did impact people with different disabilities. I'm curious, should Christians now, is it appropriate to pray for healing for our autistic children? I guess it depends on what kind of mindset you're in. If you see this as a problem, right, then it seems like that would be the natural thing, is to ask God, hey, can you correct this? But it sounds like what you're saying is, well, maybe autism doesn't necessarily need to be corrected, right? Well, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, most of us probably pray for things that we shouldn't, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't know. So there's a sense in
Yeah.
which, like, God's big enough to handle the prayers where we ask for things that we shouldn't, right? And again, I get comfort from this from certain Psalms. I love the imprecatory Psalms, because if we can, in our canon, have people crying out to God, right? Like, destroy my enemies because I hate them,
right.
and that can become part of the Psalter, then like I'm pretty sure God's big enough to handle my bad prayers too.
Sure.
So in one sense, if you think that you need to pray for something, by all means pray for it.
Okay.
But in another sense, like, I don't think it makes sense to pray for the healing of autism any more than it would make the sense to pray for healing of Down syndrome, or something like that.
Yeah.
You could certainly pray, and sometimes prayer is advocacy in action, right? So folks should be certainly engaged in praying that the families that are experiencing challenges that come from autism, right, could find the resources that they need in order to meet those challenges.
Right.
And sometimes that's going to be that, like, right, if you've got somebody in your church who's a lawyer, right? Sometimes parents need lawyers to go with them to IEP meetings to make this sort of, right? So sometimes your prayer can be showing up with your Esquire business card and like, let's talk, school.
Right.
That's a form of prayer. Everything that we do should be a form of prayer.
Yeah.
But the way that in our cultures, a couple years ago here at Calvin, we had Amy Kinney come to campus. Amy Kinney's got a fantastic book called My Body Is Not a Prayer Request.
Oh, wow.
Kinney herself is disabled. And I didn't intend to do this, but I'm actually going to get at part of your question by just reading her own experience.
Yeah, please.
Chapter 1. God told me to pray for you, she says. Her words linger like cloying perfume in a claustrophobic space. God wants to heal you. She's undoubtedly thrilled with this opportunity, but I've been here before. It never ends well. This woman does not know me. She doesn't have the intimacy that prayer or accountability or sarcasm require. She simply interprets my cane as something that requires fixing and ropes God into her ableism. The belief that disabled people are less valuable or less human than our non-disabled counterparts. Internally, I make a swift calculation. endure the prayers to avoid squabble, or call her out on her benevolent eugenics and be branded a heretic again, right? Glorious book. I actually have my students read the first 2 chapters of this book.
Okay.
You should never go up to somebody that you don't know and force your prayers upon them, because it puts a certain kind of pressure on them that it shouldn't happen, right? So like, if you're going about your life and you see somebody that you think you need to pray for, again, pray for them. Might be a guided prayer, but do it. But don't go up to somebody you don't know and, right, like try and force your view of the badness of their situation on them,
onto them,
unbidden.
Yeah.
I was meeting with another parent before we hopped on here for coffee, and I was telling this other parent a few years ago, I had our son at the grocery store. Our son is mobile, he's verbal, but the way that his body moves, you can tell that he's disabled. A lot of people can't understand him. His social interactions, right, are not what lots of people would expect given his autism diagnosis. And I was pushing him down the cereal aisle, just trying to get stuff to get home and like make dinner. I don't know if I was making cereal for dinner, but I remember it was in the cereal aisle.
Yeah.
And somebody that I didn't know came up to me, and she just, she didn't say, "Can I pray for your son?" She just said, "What's wrong with your son?" And so for me,
wow,
like,
total stranger.
You are completely, and sometimes I get tired of it, right? Because parents of disabled children and disabled people themselves deal with this pressure over and right. This is not the first time that somebody has gone up to Amy Kinney to say this.
Yeah,
you just get tired of it, and so I'm not always the most charitable person. I don't endorse all the natural responses that I have. Right? I'm a sinner.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced that this response was sinful.
Yeah.
I looked at her and I said, "What's wrong with my son is that he's growing up in a culture where you think that's the appropriate question to ask a complete stranger in the cereal aisle."
Yep.
And I was pissed.
Yeah.
Because the mere asking that question puts a certain obligation on me to respond in a way that is going to cause me all sorts of social grief and headache, which she did not respond well to my statement, or to right, just sort of allow it to go and reinforce this assumption that that's the right response for somebody to have. I've actually had former students when we got our son's autism diagnosis. One that had been involved in a public healing ministry in South America after he had graduated asked to come back. "Can I come back and pray for your son's healing?" And this was way earlier into our family's experience than I am now.
Yeah.
Even then I was like,
stay there.
If you wanted, I can't prevent you from doing it on your own.
Sure.
You don't know my son, and it's well motivated.
Right.
In one sense, right? Like maybe that's based on all sorts of problematic assumptions. But the impulse to pray for people that you think need prayer, great, right? Like I want to endorse that.
Yeah.
But the way in which already disadvantaged folks are then put at a further, right? The question puts a certain kind of demand on us to respond in certain ways. And I just get tired of it. And so if you don't know somebody well enough to know exactly how the disability is affecting their family, then maybe you shouldn't be asking those sorts of questions, right? If you want to know what our family needs at our local church, don't ask me to like come up with a disability ministry that will serve him. Right. Again, I get the impulse. Yep. It's fascinating to me that the vast majority of disability ministries are aimed at disabled children. And again, with little to no thought about disabled adults.
Right.
And our son doesn't need a different ministry that's going to further isolate him and stigmatize him. Yeah. Right? I want the regular ministry to be disability accessible. But if, again, well-meaning folks at my church have asked that question, what can we do? And then that puts the pressure on me to sort of like come up with the solutions to folks that don't really know our lived experiences. Like the best things folks can do in a local church is just become part of the lived rhythm of a family that is dealing, because you're going to then understand what their family's particular needs are in a way that once you know the family and the disabled, in this case, autistic person,
Yeah.
you might be better. Right? Like the number one
Yeah.
thing that family needs is, in one sense, when our son goes to church and he's right, he engages in echolalia, he talks to himself, phrases that he has heard sometimes weeks ago, then like keep coming out, or when he stims, engages in self-stimulatory behavior, flapping his hands, is a common one. Give us the space to do it.
Yeah.
Give us it, right? If the church is not welcoming for our loud, wiggly family, if the church is not accepting of our loud, wiggly child, it's not welcoming of our family as a whole.
Yeah.
And you're going to know that this is not our son being disrespectful if you know him.
Right.
And so it's the understanding and having the personal connection that's going to help your local congregation or people in the congregation have a better sense, right? In one sense, I don't want anybody to ask the question, what can the church do, until they've seen what it's like for our complicated family to eat dinner.
Yep.
Now, it's also really difficult for us, given family demands, for us to go out and have dinner with folks. It is really hard for us, given just our son's reality.
Sure.
To us to go to dinner at people's houses we don't know, because then we have to worry about, is the space going to be welcoming? Is he going to be on heightened anxiety? All this kind of stuff.
Right.
And it's hard for us to participate in church potluck so that folks can because even when we do have our son at church, and we sometimes don't because the demands on his life are so complicated during the week, that going into another space, even if all the folks that are around us are wonderful, and the people at our local congregation, at least sit near us, are in fact wonderful.
Yeah.
But just the demands on him, it becomes an exercise in him feeling he can't be who he is in terms of behavior management. And further behavior management is not what autistics need. They need a space that's going to allow that. So it's hard for us to be at church, and even when we're there and there's a potluck, we're probably going to skip. Not because we don't like the elders' chicken salad recipe. It's just eating in public is demanding. Eating in public with other people at the same table is demanding on us. And sometimes we're just tired and don't have it in us.
Right. And I can definitely relate to that. Every Sunday at our church, we attend an Orthodox church, and we have fellowship after the Divine Liturgy. And there's sometimes where my wife is wanting to stay in fellowship and things like that, and I'm just so exhausted by, and I don't want to say dealing with, because that sounds like that negative connotation that you're talking about, but that's what I feel like sometimes is like, okay, we've just spent an hour and a half dealing with, quote unquote, Kelsey in church, and an hour and a half for my daughter is a long time in the church setting. To go and now spend another hour, in public with what she's doing and this, that, and the other. But I love what you said in your response, Kevin, is that there are maybe one of the best things you can do in a church setting like that is to give space to let our Kelsey, whenever she stims, she rocks back and forth. She'll get on her hands and knees and just rock, and she's been doing that ever since she was a baby. We thought that, kind of touching back to what I said earlier about we started noticing things, that was one of them. Whenever she got to the age where she could get on her hands and knees and rock right before they start crawling, right? But then continued to do that way up until she was walking and running around. That stood out, Now we know that's one of her stems. That's what she does. And so instead of putting pressure on us, or kind of giving the judgmental look, well, what is she doing? Just give a space. And if my daughter, participation, we talk about participation a lot here on Faith Unaltered, and participating in that family, getting to know those people that could be one of the best things you can do for a family with a child with a disability. That's how, instead of putting pressure on them by questioning them or even reprimanding them in some senses, right? Just getting to know them will answer that question for you of, what can I do for you? How can I help you? I really like what you said there, Kevin. That's
Often,
good.
so yeah, and just to reinforce part of what you just said there, often
Yeah.
what they can do is give your daughter the space to STEM.
Yep.
There is so much pressure on autistics to what gets called masking, right? To
Yes.
hide their neurodifference,
Yes.
neurodiversity, by engaging in neurotypical behaviors and not engaging in neurodiverse behaviors,
Yes.
and encouraging an autistic not to STEM is actually going to massively backfire, because it is often a way of either responding to stress or self-regulated,
Yes.
right? And so the pressures that we can't do this then end up being unhealthy. And this is one of the reasons why the rates of anxiety and depression among autistics is significantly higher than for the non-autistic, right? Because there is a pressure, and unfortunately, it doesn't go away. I've got a former student, now graduated, diagnosed as autistic between their junior and senior year of college, or went through much of their life not knowing that they're autistic.
Wow.
And now that they know that they are, they're like, this would have been really helpful to know before.
Sure.
And they're on this process of sort of like becoming comfortable, but they've had now 20 years of basically being pressured into not stemming, and it had huge negative psychological effects on them, right? And sort of reinforcing that what they were doing to help themselves was bad in some kind of, right? This sort of like
Right.
metaphor again.
Yeah.
And we need to make not just our churches, but maybe our churches need to be at the top of the list because of what churches are supposed to be doing, right?
Yeah.
The kinds of communities that churches are supposed to be, to make it the kind of place that if there's somebody flapping or stimming or rocking or talking to themselves or whatever it is,
Yeah.
that they just have space to do it.
No, that's good. Thank you. So this kind of segues into then what we were just discussing. So, giving that this autism in general comes with a lot of stress, right? A lot of pressure. What advice do you have for parents that who are maybe feeling overwhelmed or anxious or spiritually disconnected from their church community as they navigate the challenges of raising a child with autism? What advice do you have for parents that are overwhelmed in that sense?
Give yourself some space, because the culture has put you in a situation where that overwhelm is gonna, right, be easy, natural, etc. One of the tricky things, and again, our journey has been a journey. When we got our son's autism diagnosis, sort of the experts tend to be therapists, school professionals. And oftentimes these are folks that have a very negative view about autism. They are not neurodiversity affirming types of places. And so the natural resources that come, given the way that our culture functions and how you get a diagnosis, either through a medical doctor, a mental health, right, psychiatrist, psychologist, or a school, the resources that you're giving are actually often going to be ones that reinforce these sort of negative ableist problems. So we did some early stuff that I look back and I'm like, I wish we hadn't done that, right? One of our son's early therapies, autism, one of the diagnostic criteria is about social interactions. And so one of his early therapists was like encouraging us when somebody talks to him to make eye contact. And a lot of autistics talk about how this can either just be painful for them or worrying about interpreting facial, right? Reading faces and knowing how to interpret it, and then sort of like splits the attention. And so many of them, it is way easier to talk to somebody in an engaged manner if they're not looking at the other person in the eye. And so once we discovered that, when we talk to we want some kind of response from him. right? If somebody says hi, we want him to recognize, but it doesn't have to be like stopping what he's doing and looking at the other person. And so it's just really easy for what we're told to do as a response to be, I think, misguided.
Okay.
I think that, again, one of the best things that parents of diagnosed autistic kids can do is talk to the experts.
Okay. Yeah.
Find your friends that are autistic. If you don't have any friends that are autistic, my guess is you probably do and you just don't know.
Yeah.
But right, and reach out to the experts again, and be careful of who you think the experts are. Right, the most common autism advocacy group in the United States is Autism Speaks.
Yep.
And most autistic adults probably hate Autism Speaks as an advocacy organization. Now, I think that they have gotten better over the years.
Sure.
Right? But most of their fundraising money has gone into trying to cure autism. For a long time, they didn't have any autistics that actually were on their board, et cetera, et cetera. The Autism Self-Advocacy Network is, I think, a great reach out to your local, I don't even know what state you're in, Tyler.
Indiana.
Okay.
Indiana.
Find the Indiana branch of the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. Reach out and talk to the autistic folks that are part of that. What would be the best thing for us to do as parents of a newly diagnosed? And this is exactly why I recommended that book. I'm trying to see if I still have it on my shelf here.
Yeah.
Right?
Sincerely Your Autistic Child. That one. Yeah.
Read what autistic adults have said,
Yeah.
what they wish their family would have done. Now, again, autism is a very, very broad, and we should not expect all autistics to have the exact same experience right? But in general, they're going to have a better sense of what would be useful than
somebody that doesn't. Yeah. Right on. And you said it just a minute ago, but if you don't have an autistic friend, go make one. Right? This is what we're supposed to be doing, right? As Christians. Yeah. You go ahead.
But do it in a way where you're not only using them for their autistic expertise. Right.
Like no one wants to be exploited, and so no, like genuinely develop a relationship with people, and that's sometimes just one of the best things I've done and have experienced in developing just relationships with people is people like to be listened to. Right. And so just give an ear to somebody every now and again, and you'll never know what it will do. Kevin, I could talk to you forever on this. This has been a really good interview, and I've got so many more questions. If you'd be interested in doing a part two, that would be great. I do have to hard stop here in about 10 minutes. I'll go a little bit over. So let me ask you one more question before we start winding down real quick. And I know you have mentioned some of these already. Sincerely Your Autistic Child, let's see, Elizabeth Barnes, Amy Kinney. Did I get that right? Her last name's Kinney. Is that right?
Kenny. So
okay. Kenny.
My Body is Not a Prayer. Super good book.
Okay. What are some other resources or ministries that you would recommend for people that are interested in further pursuing, just investigating autism just in general, whether or not they're a parent of a diagnosed child or not?
Yeah. So I'm just going to, first part of my answer is going to be just like me holding up a bunch of books.
Okay. No, fair enough. Go ahead.
Steve Silberman's Neurotribes that came, Silberman unfortunately died. I think it was just a few weeks ago.
Oh, wow. Okay.
One of the best. So this is a fantastic book, pretty substantive, about the history of autism research, and sort of what at the time of this writing, and done in a way that is fairly neurodiverse affirming rather than stigmatizing.
Okay.
Two other books that I want to recommend, both of which have came out in the last few years. Eric Garcia's We're Not Broken.
Okay.
Challenging the Autism Conversation is, I think, again, worth reading. And then Dan Bowman Jr.'s On the Spectrum. He teaches at, it's a Christian college in Eastern Indiana.
Okay.
Taylor University.
Okay.
Professor of English, Autism, Faith, and the Gifts of Neurodiversity. So especially he's writing in a way that Garcia and Soberman weren't, writing within a Christian context as autistic adults about sort of what their experiences have been and how it's problematic. One more just real quick. Lamar Hardwick, his first book was called I Am Strong. I think his Twitter handle is The Autistic Pastor. But he's got a new book about how ableism fuels racism, which is both super fascinating and also, as much of the history, super horrifying.
Oh, wow.
So there are some resources right there. I was trying to find one other here, see if I can do this.
Yeah.
There's great social media, right? So like most of us are on social media way more than we should be. Start listening, right? Start reading the tweets of autistic folks on Twitter, Twitterers, right? Autistic Instagram is super fascinating. There's a wonderful group on Facebook that I found out about a few months ago called Autism Inclusivity. And the thing that I really like about this space, I've learned so much. I wish I'd found this, a decade earlier. Is that anybody can ask a question. Therapists ask questions, teachers ask questions, parents ask questions, but the only people that are allowed to respond to the questions are autistics. That's not to say that non-autistics don't have anything to contribute, right? There are sometimes things that I want to say in response to but because non-autistic conversations for so long have dominated the conversation, it is fine and appropriate for there to be spaces where the only thing that I can do is sit back and listen. And so this group on Facebook, Autism Inclusivity, is really great because you get all sorts of insight from folks that have lived with autism. And there's, what's the number on here? There's 166,000 members in this group worldwide.
Wow.
So they're basically crowdsourcing expertise. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that they say on there is going to be great.
Sure.
Right? You still have to use your own discernment. But in general, this is such a help. There's all kinds of parents. A regular kind of question is, I've got an autistic child. This is what, this is one of the behaviors that they do. Help me to figure out how to understand and respond to this behavior in a way that is going to be good for my child rather than bad for my child. I don't know what that is. Help. And like the amount of, right, it's fantastic.
Yeah. No, that's really good. And that's exactly what we did whenever I had reached out to you and whenever we got the diagnosis for Kelsey, is I've started, and my wife has too, is follow that advice and start developing relationships, even internet relationships. But I guarantee you, I'm sure if we look for it, in a productive way, right? There are people in our churches with, autistic, either parents with autistic children or non-autistic parents with autistic children. Somebody somewhere is there, right? To be able to talk to. And I think that's what I'm gleaning from this conversation that we've had the most, is if you want to help participate in the lives of either parents with autistic children or just someone with autism in general. And I think that would really go a long way to answering the question, okay, now to bring this back full circle, right? And how do we help in the church? That's how you start that conversation, right? And so is there anything, Kevin, that we haven't touched on in this episode? I know you said, and if you're interested, I'd love to have you back for part 2. That'd be great. But is there anything we haven't touched on that you want to at this point? Feel free.
Yeah. And so I think that a lot of what we've said here, good place to start. But because, as a part of the earlier conversation was, right, ableism is not just an individual issue, it's a structural issue.
Yes.
One of the things that I think the church should be doing is actually advocacy work against the structural problems, right? So to make a comparison here, there were parts of the Christian church that were extremely problematic in how they responded to racial issues in U.S. history, right?
Yeah.
But if part of the gospel is liberation from oppression, right? Like those churches that were on the leading edge of the the racial civil rights movement,
Mm-hmm.
and especially those white churches that walked along their black brothers and sisters, and and listened to their leadership, but were willing to risk their own lives at some of the marches. Right, that was a profound Christian response.
Yeah.
Part of the church's response needs to be about responding to, in public advocacy sorts of ways, the structural problems that still face folks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this can be either anything from advocating for better special education funding in your local or state educational systems, to making sure that your building is actually ADA compliant, even if it doesn't legally have to be, to, as I said before, if you're a lawyer and you know that you've got a family that is going through one of these battles in a public school, then give of your time as part of your, and again, for me, this is worship, because all of it is supposed to be.
Yep.
And if David is allowed to have his worship, basically be expletives yelled at the world, then my going with a family that is really, really struggling and feeling left out, and me going in and railing against that system to make it less oppressive, less marginalizing, that can be part of my Christian ministry. You used the word pissed earlier, and you were sort of like semi-apologetic about the language here. Sure. I mentioned earlier that I love to listen to metal with one of our daughters.
Yeah.
I really happen, and I'm worried that like this connection is going to maybe lose a few folks, but I really like the band Prophets of Rage. It is part Rage Against the Machine, part Cypress Hill, part Public Enemy. And they've got this song, and for those of you who don't like vulgarity, ignore this. But one of their songs is Unfuck the World. Mm-hmm. And actually, while perhaps vulgar, I think that this is a beautiful statement of what the Christian mission is. Any place there is the world that it's not supposed to be, where there is death, bring life, where there is oppression, bring liberation, where there is suffering, bring solidarity, right? Go out and do that work too, in whatever way you can do it best, to bring God's kingdom into the lives of folks on the earth. Because, and I'm now that I quoted Chuck D, I'm also going to quote N.T. Wright here. Yeah. Right. The kingdom of God is not escape from the world. It is a recreation of the world as it's supposed to be. And that's the heart, I think, of the gospel message. And what we need to be doing is doing that in the lived experiences and the lived realities of families.
Amen. I couldn't have put it better myself, Kevin. That was awesome. And you're right. I don't know how that would do for a Faith Unaltered slogan, but we'll see. We might use it.
You start putting it in the banner behind you or something like that.
Just right there. Right.
And even folks that don't like the way that I put it, I think that the sentiment is the right way to think about it.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And to really go back on that, this is what Jesus said specifically in I think it's Matthew 25, if I'm not mistaken. But where he talks about, going out and doing things for Christians, for other people, and I would even include all image bearers of God in that sentiment. And he says this, he says, if you didn't do it to the least of these people, you didn't do it to me. And you're right, this is what we see Jesus really emphasizing in his ministry, in the short little snippet we have of his life in the scriptures. That's the primary thing that's emphasized in that, is this reconciliation, this recapitulation of, things are screwed up, but now it's time to fix that. I think that is the Christian message. And so I think that's what we should be doing as image bearers of God and as quote unquote little Christs. We should be acting like our Lord and our Master. And if that's the way to do it, then that's absolutely the way to do it. You know what I mean? But Kevin, I really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation with me. This has really made me want to really do what you recommended. And if anybody's interested that has an autism diagnosis, that would be interested in coming on the show and having a conversation with me about this topic, I think that would be awesome. And I want to go ahead and put that invitation out there for anyone that would be interested. Contact me, faithunaltered@gmail.com, and let's set up a conversation. But Kevin, thank you so much for your time.
Yep.
Brother, where can people find you at if they want? I know you've got academia, right? A page on
do,
academia,
but
or
only
okay,
because I set it up and I can't figure out how to,
how to delete.
turn it off. The best way to find me is just kevintimpe.com. So it's my first name straight into my last name.com.
Okay.
Then there's some of my advocacy resources are up there. It's also my academic webpage. If you go to the scholarship tabs, you can find a lot of my writings up there. Both either folks want to go read what Timpe thinks about free will and heaven, or if you don't want to read, like some of the more advocacy related scholarly pieces that I've done about special education or how to think about autism or something like that. So almost all of my scholarship that isn't books is available there as PDFs. And you can also just email me, kevin.timpe, either at gmail.com or at calvin.edu. And depending on what sort of email it is, I might switch over responding, from one to, I try to have like personal stuff at my Gmail and academic stuff, work-related stuff at my Calvin email. But they both come to the same program, and I might just respond from a different one. So people can reach out to me either through email or if they're interested in some of my stuff through my webpage.
All right. Well, thank you.
Academia.edu, because I do not want more of those notifications for a website that I don't know how to turn off.
No more. I appreciate it, Kevin. Thank you so much. And if you've enjoyed this conversation, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Also, think about joining our membership-only program on YouTube. We're going to be releasing a members-only live stream coming up very, very soon. And so that's right next to the big red subscribe button on our homepage. Hit the join button, follow the on-screen instructions from there, and we will see you next time. Again, Kevin, thank you so much. I really appreciated the conversation, brother.
Thank you.
And
these are important conversations to have, so I appreciate you making the time to make it happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And with that, we'll see you next time, ladies and gentlemen. Until then, good night, God bless, and stay like Christ.